Welcome back, everyone, to the POK Podcast. We're excited to have you guys back with us. This is really our first true episode since we've moved back in or moved into a new place. Today we have a topic that I'm very excited to talk about. It is kind of a doozy topic or a triggering topic. We're going to be talking about the abortion debate. And there's quite a few reasons why I wanted to talk about this specific topic. And many of you probably heard about the new Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh. There were some concerns that he might want to overturn Roe versus Wade. I think in recent weeks that's been kind of debunked, or at least he has claimed that it's settled law, is the quote from him. So I don't think there's as many concerns about that going on right now. But even so, the topic itself has become a very much a hot topic. And it's a topic that I feel like should be talked about more often in a civil and intellectual way, but often doesn't. I feel like it's one of those things that just gets simplified. People have, just a radical view one way or a radical view another way, and that's it. There is no middle ground. So today we are going to kind of break down this debate. What are the core questions that you have to ask yourself when you're trying to pick a side, and there's not just two. There's multiple sides to two sides. There's multiple sides to this debate. So it's not just should abortion be legal or illegal. There's some middle ground that we're going to go over as well. We're going to talk a little bit about how religion views abortion, and we're not going to go too much into the details of specific texts, but just kind of more generally, does religion explicitly forbid abortion? We're also going to talk about the consequences when abortion is illegal under all circumstances, or even restricted under some circumstances. And then we're also going to go through just a little bit of the history, per usual. We just do a little bit of a kind of a quick history lesson, and we're going to do that on mostly Roe versus Wade, just kind of give you guys an idea of where law around abortion was and where it's at now, and how that has affected the health of not only women, but abortion rates, and just kind of how it's spurred new conversation about the topic over time. So, to start us off, what is the abortion debate? So simply put, and this will be one of the few times I ever say that, it deals with the rights and wrongs of intentionally ending a pregnancy before normal childbirth. The debate involves two primary questions. Is abortion morally wrong? And should abortion be legal or illegal? And so here's the caveat to this particular question, or the set of questions, is just because you have answered one of these questions or even both of these questions, it doesn't necessarily end the debate for you. It doesn't end the dilemma of trying to figure out how you stand on it. Because even if you were to go and say abortion is morally wrong under all circumstances, well, there's plenty of actions that we would deem as necessary evils. Right. So, for example, just about we generally would say that murder in its purest form is evil. It's morally wrong. But we offer exceptions to that. We say, okay, well, murder is okay if it's in self-defense. And then that's kind of at the stipulation onto it, right? And you can do a very similar thing with abortion, in the sense that, okay, you can make the statement, the premise, abortion is morally wrong unless, or in this specific circumstance, and everyone has their preferences or beliefs on this. So we'll go over a little bit about that. And then, should abortion be legal or illegal? Well, even if you say it should be illegal, is it illegal in all circumstances? Is it illegal in some circumstances? And what are those conditions, and how do you know that those conditions have been met? So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. Per usual, this topic I think is immensely complicated for a number of reasons. One, it's primarily a moral debate. Normally when we've talked about topics on this podcast, they have been something that we can at least put some more objective numbers to. Like, there's some information out there that we can at least break that down and talk about it. And there's a little bit with this particular episode. However, wherever you stand on this topic isn't going to be swayed necessarily by the numbers. It's going to come down to how you answer some of these really specific moral questions.
Well, I think specifically with this topic, right, it has to do with a lot of who and how we've been built as people and our belief systems. So you can have as many numbers as possible, but if your experience and your, life up until this point has given you a certain set of beliefs or ideas, those numbers aren't going to really matter all that much.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's just kind of go over the history for a little bit to give us some context before we really go into this kind of bouncing off of questions and trying to figure out where we necessarily stand on it. And why we think the way we do about it, and keeping in mind that our beliefs and our biases are never meant to offend. And in this particular topic, I feel like I have to mention that disclaimer because I know it is a very triggering topic. So we're just going to kind of ease our way into this conversation, and keeping in mind that we might answer some of these questions differently than you may. And that's okay. That doesn't mean we can't have a conversation about it or that we necessarily have to agree on it. But there are some things that I feel that I think we all have to kind of acknowledge. There's some pertinent realities to this topic that I think we're going to have to try and find some common ground on. And we'll get to that bridge when we get there. So abortion has been around for a long time. There have been records of abortion-type techniques being used since 1550 BCE or BC, whichever your preference. The Egyptians, for example, had a technique where they would use plant fibers wrapped in honey as a method of inducing an abortion. Ancient Greece, abortion was an accepted practice. Aristotle even wrote that when couples have children in excess, let abortion be procured before sense of life has begun. So that's a very interesting quote there because it talks about the sense of life, personhood. We're going to go into that too. And then at the tail end of the Roman Empire, abortion was not viewed as murder, but rather as a crime against a husband who was deprived of a potential child, more importantly, a potential heir. Yeah. So even just, why abortion was morally wrong or morally acceptable has changed throughout the time. And the reasons for that differs between cultures. Throughout the early days of the United States, abortion was legal and it was actually advertised. U.S. law adopted the abortion statute to the British common law, which viewed abortion as permissible as long as it took place before the first detectable movement of the fetus. This specific phenomenon is called quickening and usually occurs between the first 13 to 25 weeks after conception.
Okay, so that's a decent amount of time.
Well, you would think, but perhaps not, and there's some reasons for that. So we can even briefly mention that right now, right? So that when I was looking into this topic, I was really looking for when I try and figure out my own kind of beliefs on this. Is I wanted to know how long, in the most extreme cases, can a woman be pregnant and not know. And there were cases where it was 3-4 months. And I'm sure there's even cases where it went longer than that.
Oh, there used to be a TV show, right, where I do think it was called I Didn't Know I Was Pregnant. And it was women that carried babies to term and then found out they were pregnant and they were having a baby right now. And I mean, obviously that is an extreme, insane case. But it happens.
Yeah, and keeping those cases in mind, that it makes it kind of even more complicated to figure out where I stand on, okay, when does personhood begin, or when does a mother have ample time to make a decision about what they want to do with their child, if they should be making that decision at all. So, and then further on, so between 1821 and 1965, abortions became criminalized in the United States. By 1965, all 50 states had laws that criminalized abortion in some regard. I didn't actually know this.
I didn't either.
But I guess it kind of makes sense if we had to have a whole Supreme Court case about with Roe versus Wade. So historians have kind of debated over the motivations for criminalizing abortion. Some, kind of classified as like this noble. It was to prevent women from getting unsafe abortions, and others say it was because it was deemed immoral. And in 1973, the Supreme Court became involved in abortion rights. And this is when we get the famous Roe versus Wade decision. So there's some really important details here. So if I'm kind of looking at my screen here a little bit more than usual, it's because I'm trying to make sure I get all these right. So I think it's kind of common knowledge here that Roe versus Wade is the abortion case.
Right. I think almost everyone knows that.
It's the case that legalized, quote unquote, abortions. And the Supreme Court made the decision to legalize abortions on the grounds that it fell under the right to privacy, which is interesting, which they believed was inferred from the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. And you will hear the 14th Amendment quite a bit when you're looking into arguments about abortion. Because the 14th Amendment is super important for the whole right to be a citizen, right to for due process and things like that. So this is important because the right to privacy, abortion, unborn fetuses, and a definition of personhood are not explicitly mentioned in this amendment. Essentially, the Supreme Court said in its decision that these ideas logically flow out of the written text of the Constitution. And when we talked about presidential powers and how a lot of these implied powers don't necessarily make a whole lot of sense on paper right away and have just been snowballing in recent years, that we were skeptical about it. And that might be a similar case here where how do you make that case that it logically flows from the Constitution? And because especially I don't think everyone would agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the decision that was made, and the right to privacy is included in that, apparently. Critics of the case, and there are a lot of them, include some actual current court justices that say abortions are not protected under the right to privacy. And at the conception of the 14th Amendment, abortions were already being criminalized in some states. Therefore, you could say if the right to an abortion was meant to be protected under that amendment, it would have been included in the written text. That's a bit of a stretch for me personally, but it's an argument. It's possible. You could make that case.
Yeah.
But I was going to say, and I have written here, but in contrast, you can also argue that it should have been included, but just wasn't. We know more now than we know then, so you could easily just make the same case in the opposite direction. The Roe versus Wade case specifically restricted states from regulating abortions in the first trimester, allowing them more power to regulate them in the second and third trimester, which I also think is interesting that in many ways Roe versus Wade took some power away from states to set laws around abortions, but then they also said, okay, just not in the first trimester. You can't restrict access in the first trimester, but in another, the second and third trimester, you're good. You can make whatever law you want to some extent. There's limitations to that still, but it's kind of an interesting way of looking at it.
Right.
And then since Roe versus Wade, several cases have been brought up that have expanded states' rights to regulate abortion outside the trimester model. So we now have several states that have been pushing to criminalize abortion altogether. And since and now today, supporters of Roe versus Wade claim that the decision was absolutely crucial for giving women freedom to decide when they wanted to start a family, while opponents argue that it was an overreach of judicial power on regulating abortion. So this is another interesting element to this debate is at what point should government have the power to tell someone what they can and cannot do with their body? And that's a question that I'm sure we're going to get into a little bit deeper later in the conversation.
Okay.
So this kind of sets us up to talk about the core arguments of the abortion debate and attempt to answer those primary questions, which are, abortion, is it legal, or should it be legal, and should it be moral or immoral? How do you define it? And we have a link that'll be in the below comment section or in the description for you guys to look up a little bit more information about Roe versus Wade if you're curious of the details, because there are some pretty interesting things that occurred in that case, like the woman who brought the case forth, right? The defendant, I think it was defendant, basically said that abortion should be legal, and then after the case changed her opinion on it. Yeah, so that's kind of interesting, and that's actually one of the bits of information that's often cited by opponents to the case is that even the woman who wanted to pilot
have an abortion,
decided afterwards that she kind of regretted it.
Okay.
So that's interesting. So what are the core arguments? We'll start this one off strong with probably the most important one to keep in mind when you're formulating your beliefs. And it's one of the first questions that you have to answer before you can really pick a side on this, in my opinion at least, is when does personhood begin? Everyone has a different answer to this, or at least some sort of tweaked version. So there's a couple of different main viewpoints on this one. So in Western philosophy, for example, it's defined in two kind of traditional ways. There's like this traditional epistemological view that comes from my favorite philosopher, Descartes, who defines personhood as any human agent or non-human agent who possesses continuous consciousness over time and who is therefore capable of framing representations about the world, formulating plans, and acting upon them. So to put that in normal people terms, for something to be a person, has to be able to do person things.
And that would not qualify as a fetus.
That would, So yes and no. Maybe it depends. So there are times. So in this case, it would have to be able to survive outside the womb. I think for Descartes to say that it satisfies personhood.
Okay.
So you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Viability probably is where is more the modern kind of translation of that. And then there's a contrast kind of viewpoint that I think kind of takes the opposite stance here. So Francis Beckwith argues that personhood has nothing to do with significance or function, but rather the capacity to be human. So this is often the viewpoint of individuals who believe personhood begins at conception. That's usually the modern translation of that philosophy.
Right.
You can kind of tell by the eye roll that Jordan,
I do not agree with that philosophy.
Yeah, Jordan does not agree with that, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about why we think that and our bits on that once we kind of get through these first couple bits where we're talking about the core arguments. So to kind of break this down into two of like the traditional sides to this debate, people who want abortion to be legal typically compare personhood with consciousness. To be a person, you have to do the person things. A fetus does not become a person until it is viable and can survive outside the womb. Let me just double check real quick when a fetus technically becomes viable, because I don't remember it off the top of my head. A fetus becomes viable while there's for a over 50% survival rate around 24 to 25 weeks.
Okay.
So 24, 25 weeks, as early as 23 weeks in some cases.
5 is 6 months.
Approximately, yeah. So this is a really important question to keep in mind, because just about any argument or any kind of case you make for any stance on this topic, you have to answer this question at some point. Even if you take a very moral kind of viewpoint of this, is just, abortion is wrong because of its murder. Well, you would have to define, okay, at what point does a fetus become a person to where it can be defined as murder, right? So you have to answer that question first. And then you also have to keep in mind alternatives. So we talked about this at the very beginning, right? Is an action can be immoral or evil, but still be deemed necessary or acceptable by social or societal standards. So we kind of have to figure out where that line is as well. And then this next one I included in here, really just to speak so briefly on it, because I think it's a weak talking point for this particular topic. And some of you might disagree with me on this, and that's okay. But it's, can a fetus experience pain? So I have a couple of issues with this question, mostly because it's impossible to answer. At least objectively.
There's no scientific way to accurately answer this question.
Yeah, so pain by itself, right, even measuring pain on an adult is a subjective measure right now, right? It's whatever the person experiencing it says. So we don't even have a reliable way of measuring it on an adult, and we definitely don't have a reliable way of measuring it on a fetus. But there have been accounts, like there's scientists on both sides of the aisle here that have wildly contrasting viewpoints on this. Like there have been doctors that have been performing abortions for years and then look on an ultrasound and they think they see the baby screaming in pain, and then have forever been like, no, abortions are wrong because fetuses do experience pain. But how do you know it was a scream? How do you know it wasn't a reflex? How do you know that baby was experiencing, or that fetus was experiencing pain? You don't. There's no way of knowing. Now, I will say to people that do want to make this a point of their argument, if we don't know, is it worth the risk? So that's something that you can think about. If you do not know if that fetus is experiencing pain during an abortion procedure, is it worth that risk? And is that, where are the moral implications of something like that? So we can keep that in mind. But as far as a scientific viewpoint on this, there's not one to be had.
Yeah, there's not one.
And it's very frustrating when I was reading about this, because it seems like there's so many people that, deem themselves scientists, have PhDs, and, work in the medical community. And they all have an opinion on this and they claim to have an objective opinion about this, and you can't. It's not possible yet. We don't have the tools. We don't have the measurement capacity.
We don't have the technology.
We don't have the technology. And the measurement, the thing that you're actually measuring, is so subjective that it wouldn't surprise me if we don't get to that point for a very, very, very long time. But yeah, that's my short rant about that question. It's just not a very good question to have a objective and
it's not a stable way to form an argument, right? You can't build your defense around that, because there's absolutely no way to prove it.
It's just not even a good talking point in general. Right. That's why I didn't want to spend too much time on it. Is that there's not a whole lot there to talk about.
Exactly.
Not with any kind of objective truth behind it. It's just, my BS versus your BS. That's just not a good way to have a conversation.
No.
But this one, we do have some more numbers too.
Okay.
And this is, how do abortions affect the health of women? And specifically for this part of it, I want to talk about how does the legality of abortion affect the health of women? So we're going to take a look at some numbers from some countries here that have strict abortion laws, or have some sort of limitation to abortions in their laws, and compare them with countries that have more liberal in general, or less restrictive might be a more accurate term, laws or regarding abortion. So such as the U.S., or there are some European countries that fall into this category. And so we're going to look on kind of this macro scale of what it looks like when these countries decide to make abortion illegal or restrict it in some way. So currently there are 26 countries around the world 26 that ban abortion altogether with no explicit legal reason for exception. So there's no reason. There's no exception to when you're allowed to have an abortion. Even if it's to save the woman's life, it's still deemed
100%
illegal.
of the time, no.
And so countries like this, or countries that fall into this category, include Egypt, Iraq, El Salvador, Honduras, Andorra. The Vatican also falls into this category. And so there's 26 that fall into that category. And now there's also 37 that ban abortions unless it's deemed necessary to save the woman's life. And this is in some developed countries as well, such as Brazil, Mexico, Ireland. Ireland, I think, was originally on the list, actually. Now I
think they recently just overturned that ruling.
Yeah, and then they were arguing about going back to it. We'll have to keep in tune for that one, because I don't really know what's going on there yet. Because every week I feel like it's like, oh, we're going to legalize abortion, then we're going to make it illegal again, and then we're going to legalize it, and then it's a mess in Ireland right now when it comes to abortion law.
Yeah.
So here's the important thing to note when we're going over these numbers. The rate at which women seek abortions does not change based on legality. That's a super important thing to remember here. There are plenty of resources that back that statement up. It's not just me throwing a BS claim at you based on my own bias. That there are plenty of sources to back that one up. Even in the U.S., the rate at which people seek abortions does not change whether or not it's legal. And if it does, it's a very minor and small and negligible change. But what legality does relate most to, what it does correlate with, is access to safe abortion facilities or safe medical facilities. And access to safe medical facilities is the number one determinant as to whether or not there's going to be a complication with an abortion procedure. So, with that in mind, there's only a third of all women in the world that are of a reproductive age. So this is, I think, between like 16 or 18, something like that, and low mid 30s.
You can have a baby until you're like 45.
So it encompasses a very large population, is what I'm trying to say. So a third of women of reproductive age in the world live in countries where abortion is permitted without restrictions. That means 2/3 of all women that could potentially have a child are living in a country where abortion is limited or restricted in some way, or altogether. Every year, this is from a source called Gut Matcher. I think it's our Gut Masher or Gut Matcher. Probably Gut Matcher is probably the more correct pronunciation of it. But keeping in mind, I'll post the link for the resource. But they are an organization that does have bias against abortion, restrictive abortion laws. So keeping that in mind, some of these statistics might be a little bit more leaning towards a particular argument.
Mm-hmm.
But before Roe versus, I didn't even mention this. Did I mention the 23,000 women die every year due to complications with an abortion procedure?
Well, yeah. Well, I'll say that later.
But it almost exclusively occurs in countries where abortion is restricted.
Right. Because you can never outlaw abortion. You can only outlaw safe abortion. People are still going to do it. People are still going to not have the money or the means or the, emotional strength to have a child. And they're still going to seek out the solution, whether or not it is safe or legal.
I completely agree. And that's kind of what I was touching at when I was mentioning there are some realities here to this topic that we kind of have to, we don't necessarily have to agree perfectly, but we have to compromise on this. Like, abortions are going to happen.
And no one likes abortion. We've talked about this before. No one is for abortion, but it is safer for citizens of any country to have it legal and to have it provided, through whatever doctor or practitioner, so that person doesn't die or get themselves into a terrible situation.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things that it's part of the reality of the world that we live in that we kind of have to figure out the most appropriate way to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of our viewpoints here in a second. But just in the United States, one more fun fact before I get to the United States.
Okay.
There are countries where unsafe abortions are actually the leading cause of maternal death. Tanzania being a prime example. And it blows my mind that's one of the leading causes of maternal death is women taking it upon themselves to seek an unsafe abortion.
It's just sad.
Yeah, and it's not like the women don't know. Maybe I'm wrong on this, but and correct me if I'm just bonkers, but I had this feeling that most women know the risk they're taking if they're going to do an abortion themselves, or they're going to try and do something similar to that on their own.
Yeah, I think that there's a level of hopefulness or desperation, right, that would cloud your judgment as far as your safety goes. But as I've said to you before, fear is a wonderful motivator.
Yep. And in the United States, before Roe versus Wade, on average, 5,000 American women died each year from unsafe abortions. And restrictions in many states have been getting tighter since around 2008. And what they've discovered in a national survey was that approximately 2.5% of women in the U.S. try to terminate a pregnancy on their own. I don't know how reliable that number is, but if that's the case, that's still a lot of women, considering there's 350 million plus, Americans living in the U.S. and half of them are women. So just doing some quick math, right? So look, 180 million women, 2.5% of that is still a lot of women.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if that's, I'll have to double check where I got that one from. But yeah, that just sounds like a super intense number. But here's the part that makes a lot of sense. Google search records also show that women were looking up how to terminate a pregnancy at home more often as restrictions around abortion rights increase, which is crazy to me, but makes so much sense, right? If you're worried that you're not going to be able to get an abortion, should that situation come up, and you really know that's a decision you're going to make, and immediately you're like, well, it's not going to be able to do it anymore. You're going to have access to I shouldn't say that. That's a very poor taste way of phrasing it. But I won't be able to get safe access to a medical facility. So I need to figure out how to do this on my own in some way that's, going to work, I guess. It's gruesome.
It's gruesome, and it's so heartbreaking for me in the sense that, all right, I think it's pretty obvious that I don't necessarily agree with people that are anti-abortion. But for someone to be so scared and so concerned about their future in regards to a pregnancy, and then for their government, especially the American government, that's all about choice and freedom and do as you will kind of thing, to have that fear that privilege is going to be taken away from you. And I can't even imagine what that feels like.
Yeah, and I think I do want to mention one thing. You had mentioned anti-abortion. And one of the things that I think actually stirs up conflict in this conversation is that term, or those terms of pro-life, pro-abortion, anti-abortion, right? Because everyone is pro-life. No one is like, life is bad, y'all.
No one's like, boo.
They're these divisive terms inherently, because they don't really represent the viewpoints of the people who are trying to advocate for one side or another in a sufficient way.
That's fair. I misspoke.
Oh, no, you're fine. But it's a point that I wanted to bring up because it's one of the biggest frustrations I have about this conversation, because don't get me wrong, even I sometimes struggle with this particular topic when I'm discussing it with other individuals, because I am so concerned about offending someone, or I am so concerned about being misunderstood that someone's going to view me in such a harsh light. And it's really frustrating and I almost know immediately if I'm going to be misunderstood or be put in a position where I'm having to defend myself. And that's usually when I hear those terms is pro-life or pro-abortion. Because again, even with the no one's
yes, for killing babies.
Yes, let's get abortions. We're super excited. No, we're not. No one's doing that.
Right.
No one is doing that.
It's not about, for the people that are, for lack of a better term, pro-abortion. It's not about, yay, we're ready to kill some shit. It's about...
they're pro the legality of abortion. Well, that's maybe a better way of putting it.
Sure, they're pro the legality of abortion. It is about the health and safety and mental care of the women getting those abortions, and much less about the fetus itself.
Well, when you say mental care, right, so that's actually a point that I think people with a different view or a opposing viewpoint would point out, is say, well, what about the psychological harm that is caused by having an abortion?
Well, I think that there are some women that would struggle with it, and I think that there are some women that wouldn't. But if...
Well, so there's actually some data behind this, right? There have been a couple of studies that have looked into what are the mental health risks of getting an abortion, and just about in every case, the risk of suicide, depression, and anxiety goes up, and including in their male partners. Depression and anxiety is more present in males whose partners have gotten an abortion. There's occasionally feelings of regret being reported as well. So I think for me, I'm comfortable saying that there are psychological risks to getting an abortion. That does not mean to me, though, that abortion should be banned or not permitted. It's the alternatives.
So I get that for some women there might be psychological risks to getting an abortion, but I also think there are plenty of highly educated 20-somethings that may accidentally get pregnant for whatever reason or another, and they run the numbers in their head and say, okay, I don't have time for this. I'm working on my career. I don't have the funds to raise a baby, this, that, and the other. I'm going to get an abortion and do better. And it's not, I don't want to say it's not a big deal, but, it's much more of a pragmatic decision than it's this struggle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think we were kind of touching on this, right? Is you have to keep the alternatives in mind. What is the alternative consequence to not having that abortion? Mm-hmm. And the way I have viewed this, and there might be plenty of people that disagree here, has been, I think it's completely unrealistic to say that being pregnant does not have negative consequences. Mm-hmm. I think that's absolutely the case. And it's hormonal consequences, and not necessarily bad or harmful consequences, but there are consequences, it's changes, physically limiting, right? You have to eat certain things. You have certain cravings. You are eating more, so it might also be a financial burden. It most definitely is a financial burden from some people.
Well, the doctor's visits alone, if you don't have insurance... obviously there are free health clinics and they can do so much, but going to a hospital and having a baby is stupid expensive.
And actually to that point, I have a question that I wanted to ask. We'll just go into kind of our back and forth with questions here because I'm curious about a lot of these. Do you think the government should pay, or rather tax dollars should pay for some individuals to have an abortion? And if so, what circumstances would need to be satisfied?
So this is also including things like Planned Parenthood and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so currently a very small portion, but a portion of Medicaid goes to abortion procedures. So
yes, and here's why. abortions are not an expensive procedure, especially if it's an early term abortion. You basically get given a pill, right? And you get super sick for a while. So it's not an expensive procedure, at least for early term. And that cost versus the cost of someone who can't have an abortion and now has a child, right, that's going to need Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps and government support for however many more years of its life, that cost far outweighs the cost of this one abortion.
Yeah, no, and I hear you. I think there's some people, though, even though it doesn't cost much, it really is just such a small, minor cost to Medicaid funding.
They don't want the government killing babies, paying to kill babies.
I think our biases here have become obvious.
Well, but still, from a pragmatic financial
I hear
perspective, yeah.
I hear you. And I think in principle, my gut reaction is to say no, tax dollars shouldn't go towards it.
Right.
But I also think that the long-term consequences, say even if you were going to do adoption,
okay,
it's costing a hell of a lot more than an abortion procedure. So I think
it doesn't cost the mother anything, right?
I'm talking about tax dollars.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, because you have to pay for a bunch of different services. You have to have a bunch of different tests done on the child. And then carrying the child to term will cost the mother something. Maybe not money, but it will be, like I said, there's physical and hormonal, emotional consequences that happen. So when I view it that way, so that's something that I've always struggled with this topic is what is the alternative? Mm-hmm. And I haven't always been aware or have even looked into it because it was such a scary topic. But especially after doing our foster care podcast, when we talked about
learning about the life outcomes, right?
The life outcomes and the risks that are associated with adoption. Yeah, I can't really make a very strong case as to why the federal government shouldn't fund at least certain case abortions.
Right.
And or even so I can't say that they shouldn't because the alternative is okay. So they're going to fund pregnancies or actually birthing babies and then going through an adoption process. But over the long run, if you just want to make a financial comparison, you're spending more money doing that. Mm-hmm. So, and now
whichever way you slice it, keeping that child, that fetus alive is going to be more expensive for the government.
Yeah, and I agree. And that might be viewed as a kind of insensitive way of looking at it. But we're just trying to isolate this one particular element of the conversation. So keep that in mind. We're not saying that, there's a dollar amount you can put on a child.
Absolutely not. But I think it's important to bring this up because I feel like a lot of times you have abortion is wrong. All lives matter. Oh, well, you're lazy and you're on Medicare and Medicaid or food stamps or whatever. Do better. And it's like, well, those are conflicting ideas. Mm-hmm. You're devaluing that child the second that it's born, and that's hypocritical.
I agree. So here's a question I've been wanting to ask, and I think we've had kind of a conversation about this, and I think at one point we disagreed, but I think I've kind of come around full circle to this one, which was, do you think men should have any legal right or say in whether or not their partner or the woman who is carrying quote unquote their child, do you think they should have any legal say in whether or not an abortion occurs?
I think at the end of the day, it is the decision of the woman that is pregnant, right? It is her body. It is her business. It is ultimately her choice. However, if she is with someone who isn't a whatever, like isn't some sort of negative circumstance, like it was a one-night stand or he's hardcore addicted to drugs or, whatever. if it's not something like that and they have a healthy communication, healthy relationship, I definitely think that the man's opinion should be asked and considered. But ultimately, it is the woman that has to carry the baby and give birth to the baby and be the feeding mother and all of that stuff. So ultimately, it is the woman's decision for me.
So what if it's almost in the opposite direction, right? So part of the conversation around abortion rights involves women having the right to choose when to start a family.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like in some ways you could argue that they have a little bit more control over that when abortion is legal.
Okay.
But men do not, right? So say you get a girl pregnant and or a girl is pregnant. And she doesn't want to have an abortion. And it was an unintended pregnancy. And then now the man or the guy in the picture here whose child it would be doesn't have the resources to support a child. But if that baby is born, the man might be required to pay
child support. Yeah.
Child support. How do you? That's a really complicated kind of dilemma there, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But it kind of turns it around. I haven't really thought about this one too much. It just kind of came to my head.
Huh. I don't know.
Right, because that seems kind of contradictory, doesn't it?
Right, it's not fair to the man, right? Yeah.
Yeah. At least on paper, how do you manage that?
Yeah. Well, and then you have the crazy women, right, that intentionally get pregnant by guys so that they can, quote unquote, trap them and get their money and et cetera, et cetera. Like, newsflash, there's super shitty people in the world that do that kind of thing. So
I don't know if y'all can hear right now, but our cat is currently crying at the door. So if you hear that,
she's fine. Don't worry about her.
She's not dying, but if you hear her, that's what it is.
I apologize.
She just wants.
She's a spoiled brat, and she wants to be in here.
Yeah. So yeah, that was kind of one of my questions about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know how to answer that question.
Like, at least from like a legal precedent, I have no idea where to start with that. Maybe you guys have some thoughts on that. Please let us know.
Yeah, what is y'all's opinion on that one?
Yeah, because I don't really. I'll have to ponder on that one some more and see if I can come up with like some sort of like logical thing that makes sense.
Better answer.
I don't think we've talked about this one yet. Does religion explicitly forbid abortion? So I looked into this a little bit, and I really brought this up as one of the more open-ended questions because I wanted you guys to kind of give your thoughts on this one. Because it's even between religions, it's very mixed. Now, there are some that just outright no, you can't have an abortion. So Hinduism, for example, always has very clear
that doesn't surprise me, though.
That forbids abortion. Christianity, for example, though, it's very mixed. And actually, in some ways, it comes back to that personhood question as to whether or not
Christianity is intentionally vague. So
some would disagree with that, though.
I believe that Christianity is intentionally vague.
Fair. But yeah, even with Christianity, it's not necessarily super clear.
Mm-hmm. That's fair.
So it really, and which is interesting because there even are some Christian groups that are very much for abortion rights.
I think there's plenty of progressive Christians that think that it's not their right or decision kind of thing.
And Islam, for example, again, very much comes down to the personhood question. So for them, they define personhood as being after 120 days after conception, where the fetus gains a soul.
Oh, okay.
Which is very interesting. I did not know that.
I didn't either.
So I think that's something worth considering as well, because I feel like we've, at least for me, I've had kind of these preconceived notions about what certain religions probably think about abortion.
Well, I knew it doesn't surprise me that Hinduism, it's a very peaceful culture. That's one of the religions I studied in college. I know that there is a lot of unrest in the Muslim community right now because there are younger, more progressive Muslims that don't necessarily agree with a lot of the, like, it's basically like Old Testament, New Testament, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have an older generation that has these more fire and brimstone ideas, and this younger generation who is much more accepting and open and grew up with the internet and understands that everyone's different. So I wasn't sure what theirs was going to be.
Yeah, no, it was just kind of interesting to look at because I definitely had some preconceived biases about what I thought. I'm in the sense of being fully transparent. I've had some issues in the past with religious groups, not in a hostile way necessarily, but just from my educational background. And so I have definitely built up some prejudices that I have to keep in check sometimes. That, I just assumed certain things about certain belief systems, and that's a really bad habit to get in, so don't do that. But
whereas I've only had positive experiences with other cultures and religions, and my negative experiences come from American culture.
That's fair. Well, and keeping in mind, the experiences I'm referencing, were private Christian schools.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's still like
we're still both talking about Christianity.
I mean, yeah, and this isn't to hate on all Christians by any means.
We have no problem with Christianity,
but there's absolutely been some experiences in our lives that have built up some prejudices, and so that's something that we have to be careful about when we're talking about it. And that's one of the reasons I didn't want to spend too much time talking about it, because I knew we were going to slip up at some point and say something. But to keep that in mind, we do have a bias.
Exactly.
And so that's affecting kind of the way we look at it in our perception. So keeping that in mind, cut us some slack. So here's another interesting thing that I thought was almost that I had a kind of preconceived notion about is, how do women's rights groups look at abortion, so such as feminist groups? And it's still mixed.
Really?
There's not a consensus over it. Because,
I would have thought for sure.
No, there's not. No, it's mixed. Now, granted, you probably hear more about women's rights groups trying to defend abortion rights.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are several different sectors of women's rights groups that still advocate for women's rights, but believe that certain rights don't outweigh others. So, for example, the right to live outweighs equality or the right to control your own body. And they would claim, or in this particular case, that they answer the personhood question probably being at conception here. So you become a person at conception. And so that right to live outweighs it. And again, it always comes back down to this question with this particular topic is, when does personhood begin? For me, it has always been the viability thing, right? If the child is a viable child and doesn't need the womb to survive anymore, it's a person,
right?
That's where I'm iffy on whether or not abortion should be legal. At that point, at least I think a doctor should have the right to say no to conducting an abortion. But that's a tangent. Some would say that abortion actually sidesteps the oppression of women. For example, if a woman is raped, the rape is the issue, not being pregnant. So I've heard that perspective on it quite a few times. I don't see why they can't both be a problem, a circumstantial problem.
Yeah, it reminds me of people getting mad because you're talking about one cause and they're like, well, what about all the starving people and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, both of them are problems.
Yeah, and when I say circumstantial problem regarding rape, I mean the act of sex when it's not consensual is a problem. But so
getting
is being pregnant
from that
when it's not your decision is a problem. Right. So I think they both can be problems.
Right.
But it's what are the circumstances? It's not black and white. And I think particularly around this topic that it gets perceived or at least mentioned or talked about in a black and white way.
Right.
And here's my favorite one. Favorite arguing point from one of these women's rights groups that are trying to make abortion illegal, is abortion as a male plot. Yeah, we were trying to control women's bodies, apparently. I mean, well, yeah.
Well, all the people making the laws are men.
But as I think where they were going,
conspiracy, no.
It came off so conspiracy theory to me, so I kind of just like chuckled at it. But
okay, but in their defense, it is very frustrating that the people making the laws and rules about women's reproductive health are almost exclusively men.
That I do understand and agree with.
Like, you don't have a womb. Why do you get to make the rules?
Yeah, so part of it's like this, almost like, how can you truly sympathize? You can empathize, but there's no way you can sympathize with that, what that experience is like, why a woman would choose to do something like that, and even have an accurate perception of what the consequences are for one action or the other when it comes to the decision to make an abortion or have an abortion. So I don't think men are particularly qualified to have the sole voice of reason when it comes to abortion laws. I think, and I think about this actually very similarly in a logic perspective to the way I think about gun laws. Is that I don't think that just non-gun owners should be the ones making the laws. But in reverse, I don't think it should just be gun owners, right? Because it affects all people.
Right.
And abortion in many ways does affect more than just the woman who's undergoing the procedure. There's more individuals involved. There's the partner that, got you, or whoever man got you pregnant. There are consequences to them, especially if they know about it. There are consequences to the doctor. So there's all these other people involved. When I say consequences, I don't necessarily refer to them in a negative light, but they are real changes.
Cause and effect.
Yeah, causes and effect. And some of these are psychological, some of them are emotional, some of them are physical. What other questions? How do women try to figure it? Did we talk about this one, the health consequences of having an abortion worse than not having an abortion?
No.
I don't think we've gotten to that one yet. So that's something that another arguing point is having an abortion in and of itself has health consequences. Not having an abortion has health consequences, right? And I think it just gets misconceived as having to, health consequences just don't exist either way, or they exist only in one scenario or the other, but that's just not true.
It's both.
They're just different consequences. Making the decision to say, okay, which one's worse than the other? Well, that's kind of subjective. It's whatever's, however it is weighed and perceived by the person who's making that decision.
Right.
That's kind of how I view it, right? Is if you're the one deciding, hey, I either need an abortion or want to get an abortion or take this child to term, weighing the consequences of either decision, it's already a hard enough choice as is, but there is positives and negatives, I think, in both, looking both ways.
Right. They both have consequences and they both have benefits.
That being said, I don't mind. So here's another thing: is you have some of these clinics, right, that basically try and convince women not to get abortions by telling them all the bad things that happens. And then, how miraculous babies are, et cetera, et cetera. And then,
all right, tangent.
I hit a trigger.
There's nothing miraculous about having a baby. All right. Come at me if you want. It is a biological reproduction. Every single day there are babies born. Every single day, every mammal on this planet has reproduction. Is it beautiful? Is it rewarding?
But Jordan, every single baby is just a little bit different.
That's how genomes work. All right.
I mean, see,
that's how the XY chromosomes pairing up works.
So here's how I view this, right? I take kind of like almost a humorous analogy to this, but don't get me wrong. Yeah, every baby's a little different.
Mm-hmm.
So is every French fry in my McDonald's canister. They're all a little bit different cut. They all have different proportions of salt on them.
Every leaf on a tree, but when they fall off, you're going to go pick them all up like they're the same, all right?
And don't worry, we joke and kid, but
I think
from the miraculous defining it as the statistical anomaly, I think it's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, it is not.
Yeah.
It is what our bodies are designed to do. So while it may be beautiful and fulfilling and whatever else, it is not a miracle. All right? So stop calling it a miracle.
And is there anything, I think we've kind of gone through our opinions and our biases on this. And there's some that we obviously have a stronger opinion than others about, and some questions that we still haven't been able to answer.
Right.
And we would love to hear your guys' opinion on that. But before we wrap up, is there any other questions or any last thoughts that you would like to mention?
I would just like to reiterate the point that while you may not agree with abortion, whether it be a religious or a moral or a whatever else driving factor for you, I think that it is paramount for people to remember that although things happen and exist in their ecosystem in a specific way, that everyone is a different collection of experiences, and you can never fully sympathize with someone else and why they would be in a situation that they were in, and why they would be in a circumstance where they felt that an abortion was necessary, and taking that right away from them, voting for people that want to take that right away from them, is hazardous to the health of your fellow Americans, of your fellow man. And so just keeping in mind that while from your perspective, this is not something you agree with, to rob someone else of that choice is just as unfair.
And I would just kind of add to that you don't necessarily have to agree with it from a moral perspective, because it might not be your preference, as you said, but it is a reality.
Mm-hmm.
It is a consequence. It is a event, a thing that is going to occur, and it's going to occur a lot more than you might like.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to happen. And what we can do is the best that we can given that reality. And if that means access to medical facilities so that these procedures can be done in a safe, and professional environment that mitigates the risks, and if counseling can be provided where it is in the best interest of the client and not just trying to convince them of your preferences, so that women in particular can make smarter health choices regarding this decision.
More educated.
Be more educated. Those are all things that we can do to help mitigate some of the risks and negatives of having to deal with something as life-changing or as
serious.
Because getting an abortion can't be easy for anyone. It really can't. I can't even really imagine or even be sympathetic. So I can't even begin to fathom. So understanding that it's not an easy call for anybody, and that it is, I don't think anyone views it in the super positive light. It's always kind of like this necessary evil, I feel like, that no one wishes that they have to go through. But also recognizing that the alternatives could be perceived as much worse for them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where I would like to leave it, is that
have a little heart.
Yeah, I mean, understanding that it's not just, it might not be black and white for you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it might not be black and white for the person going through a procedure like that. So keeping that in mind, trying to figure out, but is there better ways to answer these questions? Are there more questions that we still need to answer to kind of figure out where we stand on this?
Mm-hmm.
We would love to know you guys' thoughts on this.
What do you agree with? What do you disagree with?
Yeah, is there something that you're just false, fake news? Let us know.
Definitely.
Don't forget, if you want to support the POK Podcast directly, you can go to our Patreon page and become a patron. You get early access to all of our episodes, and you get to tell us what you would like to hear next so we can create a podcast episode around it. And to those of you who have asked before that if we are going to get guests on the show, we are actually very close to making that happen. I would expect in the next couple of episodes at least, we will try and figure out we have a couple people that we think might be interested and would want to come and join us and talk about it and have more importantly, have perspectives that differ from our own, which is great because it allows for some more thought-provoking conversation, I feel like. So that is going to happen. And if you like what you're seeing, hit that subscribe button, hit the bell, and we will see you guys next time. Thank you for listening.
Bye.